Start talking. Yay, it's on. Great. Hi, everyone. I want to introduce you to my friend, Alan. Sorry. Apologize for that. Yeah, I want to introduce you to an amazing man who has this skill to be everywhere talking about creativity. Robert Allen Black. He's an advocate, an author, a speaker, a consultant, a facilitator, and a college professor, and so much more. He is a photographer extraordinaire and who is going to be going to New Zealand and talking about photography down there very shortly. I want to introduce you to him. I had never heard of him before, and I met him on the Creative Activist site, and I've been amazed at some of the conversation we've already had, and I'd love to have you meet him. So, how do you describe creativity?
Okay. As I mentioned in an email, I stay away from the word creativity. I use the term creative thinking.
I know, that's why I wanted to talk about it.
There are 7 billion people on the face of the earth, and there may be 4 million different definitions for the word creativity. So for the last 40 years, roughly, I've been using the term creative thinking. The generating of ideas that are new to you, or old ideas in new combinations.
Okay. So how did you get started in this arena of creative thinking?
1976, my first wife and I received a letter saying that our oldest son, Jeffrey, had done very well on IQ test, and then he qualified for gifted education. But they didn't have a program. They didn't have a teacher. While I was active in the PTA, I tried to be as active as possible in my son's lives because my parents tried but couldn't for various reasons. And when I went to the PTA meetings, I kept asking the vice principal and occasionally the principal, what can we do at home? What can I do for him at home that's different? Finally, one night, the principal, I guess, got tired of me asking and said, I have 23 children, I have a room and a little money, do you have any time? I laughed at her at the time, working 6 days, get paid for 3. We were going through a very bad economic time in the mid-70s because of the gas inflation and many other factors. Double-digit financial inflation, prices going up in grocery stores almost daily. But there was something about it that just haunted me all weekend long. So on Monday morning, I went to the 2 partners of the architectural firm I was an associate with, and the 2 of them and I were partners in a graphics firm as well. And I said, I don't know where this is going to take me, but I want to give them 1 day a week. Do you have any problem with it? I'll gladly work on weekends or at night. They had no problem with that because I've been salaried for a long time. So I called the principal and said, I'll give you 1 day a week. Where do we go from here? Well, over the next few months of trying to learn how to teach, how to make it fun and interesting for these kids from K through the 5th grade, one of them, my oldest son, I came across a couple articles by a man named Torrents. One, he talked about everyone is born with capacity to think creatively. The other one was about the fact that you can teach creative thinking. Those fascinated me. Well, to zip up to a few years, I became a doctoral student with Paul Torrents, and I did my doctorate focused on the teaching of creative thinking, skills, and traits and tools. And since 1983, I have been trying to spread that around the world however I can, whether it's in written, electronic, face-to-face, audible, such as this, a video. And my main goal is to help people accept that they are creative, that 2, they can get rid of the barriers that block them, that may have come from their society, their professions, their families, their religions, whatever large organization they belong to. Because most large organizations, whether it's a professional group or a culture, want conformity. Conformity is the death of creativity. But some conformity is necessary, like which side of the road we're going to ride on, and so forth. I have no argument with that. So many people in Massachusetts had trouble with that white line. They don't know what it's for. That's when the crowd laughs a lot. Now, I have relatives from Massachusetts, and that's a standard joke that they don't know what that line is for. Anyway, so that was it. Well, my background prior to that is I had worked in eight different professions or occupations that were all labeled highly creative. Architecture, cartooning, writing, and display work. While I was working on my doctorate, I managed to get a teaching position in the art department, which I also got a head position with the landscape school, so I was teaching full-time for 4 years between those two schools. But then in '84, I left to start my own practice as a full-time speaker and not just part-time, which I had been doing since '76.
Okay.
So
that's
wherever
quite a
I
career.
That's the career I created.
I know. I love it. And it's exactly what you just said. You created it. So I'm curious, as we've talked, so is your son in the creative field since he was off the charts with creativity and had you as a dad? And is he in a creative field?
Seemed to have stopped.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. There was a pause there for a minute.
Okay. Yeah, technology. We're having a major thunderstorm here and lightning, so I don't know if that affects anything or not, but my dog's going nuts. It's probably what you hear in the background. She's barking. So.
Because of the storm. No, we have beautiful, clear blue sky today with a high pollen count, but welcome to Georgia. We have every tree that people are allergic to all in this one little town.
Okay.
So the pollen count can be pretty high, in well over 1,400 at times.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't do well. I have a lot of allergies. I would not do well down there. So
Well, that's what people discover when they move here is they have allergies they didn't know they had.
Okay.
Because we have so many different kinds of trees.
All right. Well, I did want to ask you a little bit more. We'll go back step a little. You said that, there are always blocks to creativity. So one is conformity. What are some of the other blocks that people have, and how can we get out of those blocks?
Well, each of them can be dealt with, and there are many, depending on whose book you read or what article. But the one that was kind of the leader for that, there were two. James Adams, which he called blockbusting, creative blockbusting, in which he talks about categories of them. The social categories, the mental, the emotional categories. One of the biggest is when you ask 100 people randomly in a mall or wherever there is a large number of people, and you just, as randomly as possible, ask 100 one question: do you think you're creative? The highest percentage will say no. And the early research would keep saying that. People don't think they're creative. Well, there's a question they might have asked also. What does it mean to be creative to you? Because what I would get often when I first started that back in the early 80s, randomly doing it on weekends, walking around the mall while my wife was shopping or I was just killing time, is you need to ask the other question, what does it mean? Because most of the time people would say, no, I'm not creative, I can't draw. I didn't ask if you can draw or not. I asked if you think you're creative. So the question itself is a problem. Because what does it mean? Well, the basic definition I've been using for all these years is what Paul Torrents had written about in that first article, and he kept driving home. Because what he was trying to do was find ways to measure it, measure creative thinking potential and growth, which my dissertation dealt with as well. But what he looked for were first 4 variables that he had discovered when he studied highly creative people. 1, they're very fluent with ideas. They generate lots of ideas. Well, not every highly creative person does, but a large percentage do. They're also extremely flexible, meaning that when they generate 144 ideas, they're not all the same thing. They're not a list of 144 colors. We can make something. There may be a dozen about color, a dozen about texture, a dozen about materials, a dozen about process, and so forth. The other one is they do a lot of hitchhiking or combining of ideas. Another variable is he found ways to measure for originality. And it was just based on who responded to what. Well, as his database got larger into the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions, he had pretty solid data about what's considered an original idea in the United States, or a particular state in the United States, or in a particular country like Singapore or South Africa. When an idea would come up, they would compare it to the ideas they had already collected and determine whether it's original or not. Eventually, his early tests from the 50s led to what are now called the Torrents tests of creative thinking, of which there are several types, but they actually measure approximately 20 variables that they look for. Every one of them can be taught or improved. In one of my research studies for my dissertation, for my doctorate, I looked at what are traits of highly creative people. And I chose 4 journals, 2 psychological and 2 educational journals as my reading material. So I wouldn't have to do it for years and years and years. And I chose arbitrary dates of 1950, which was when J.P. Guilford, who was APA's president at the time, and challenged the membership, we should research creative people. That hadn't been the norm. It was always researching sick people and so forth. He said we ought to research, and Torrents was one of his spin-off people. He agreed, and there were several others in the 50s and 60s. Well, I looked from 1950, from when he gave his speech, to 1980, which is when I was doing my study. And instead of finding those magical 7 traits of highly creative people, kind of like Stephen Covey with his successful, effective people, there shot my idea of a famous book that would make me wealthy. Instead, I ended up with a chart with 457 different traits.
Wow.
That 140 some or 150 some noted authorities at the time had written about in those 30 years. First reaction for me was depression because I didn't have my instant 7 to 12, the magic numbers. And I had this on a 1/4 by 1/4 grid paper and had it posted in our married housing apartment. It went from the front door to the outside wall.
Wow.
So I had to walk by it many times every day. And finally I said, there's got to be a pattern here somewhere, which, by the way, is a trait of a highly creative person. They see, and also right-brain people, they have a tendency to see patterns that other people don't. Anyway, I started looking for the patterns, and I arbitrarily chose how many of these do at least 5 experts agree on. And I found 32. And ever since then, summer of 1980, in all my travels around the world, I have used that exercise to try to get people talking about the fact that there are many different kinds of traits, and the fact that you may be more creative than you accept. You're just not capitalizing on them. Or your employer doesn't allow you to. Or it's against your religion, or whatever variable, whatever, quote, box you are in, restricts you. But every one of those 32 can be trained, can be measured. And so I added those 32 the last 12 or so years with Torrents is 20. So I have 52 traits. And it's a yearly long development program, which most people quit at about the 6th week because they get tired of all this. Is that each week you take one of the traits and you make a point of doing something every day for 15 minutes to an hour, focusing on that trait. It's not highly scientific or sophisticated. It's simple.
Why don't you give us an example? What's your favorite one to share?
Highly creative people tend to be highly curious. They're always looking into new things. When they're waiting for a doctor's appointment, they don't read the usual magazines. They read the magazines that they would stereotypically never read. They're always looking for something different. So what I would say, okay, go to a magazine store or to a library and go choose a half a dozen magazines you would normally not look at. Take some of those little post-it notes or torn pieces of paper, whichever, and flip through the magazines, find one or two articles in each that are about things you've never read about before, and then do that. But do something like that each day, whether it's a book where you pick a book off your shelf and just randomly open it to a chapter and read for 15 minutes. The thing is to spark your curiosity.
Right.
To become successful, the belief is you have to focus. Focus, focus, focus. But in reality, to be highly creative and keep those juices going, you need to have a wide spread of curiosity. That's one example.
Okay. I love that. That's great. So, in an organization, when you go in and you talk to them about changing their culture and creating a creative culture, what do? I mean, what is that process like? What are some of the elements that you bring forward in those kind of discussions?
Over the years, I've tried a variety of things. Whether or not I've changed any culture or not, there's only a couple I've ever spent enough time with to actually have that happen. I'm kind of like the speaker du jour. Somebody saw me who has authority over money and said, hey, he'd be great, bring him in, and I come in and do the program. Well, one company, through an agency in Malaysia, I did 11 two-day programs in the last couple of years. Dell Computer, based in Malaysia. Most of the people were either customer service people or call center people of one type or another. And what I would introduce is the fact is what makes a creative environment. One, it's open. The supervisors, managers, directors are open to new ideas. People are actually encouraged to spend part of their day trying to come up with new ideas. Many places over the years, they would resist that because that's not what you're being paid for. There was the belief, even in the early 80s when things seemed to be changing, that employees were basically like draft animals. We don't care about your brain. Leave that at home. Just come and do your job, the mass production approach. But then there seemed to be a tendency toward, we ought to listen to employees. They have ideas. But then there's a hesitancy. How can a factory line worker come up with a new solution? They don't have engineering degrees. They don't have experience and so forth. Well, the quality movement happened in the 80s, and companies started to listen. And that became very popular, but it's died again. It comes and goes. It's not the new thing. Americans and much of the Western Europeans have a tendency to want to do new things. They don't do anything for more than 18 months until they do something new. That's what I've tended to see. Now, other people I know have had more success. But the key is what variables? The physical variables, okay, make it more free. There's a lot of discussion now about when I was a young architect, I was with a firm, we were one of the first to do cubicles, freestanding cubicles. Herman Miller hadn't even started making them yet. It was something you would find in almost every architect's office and most engineering offices in Europe. They built these little cubicles. They used the vertical space or the vertical barrier to tack up things, not just photos of the family. And most leading architectural design firms did that naturally. Well, we were doing it for IBM. We were hired to do this one building outside of New York in Sterling Forest. It was meant to be a research center for IBM, in which they had a huge mainframe computer in the center core of it. But all the offices had to be designed in such a way with not permanent walls, but demountable walls was the word at the time. And there really was no system. That was my job on that project, was to find how do we do it? How do we move walls? Because what they wanted in their request was that the entire office area could be converted over a weekend.
Oh,
and people would move. They would be given a note on Friday that your office will be here, such and such, when you come back in on Monday. Take any specific personal things with you. Otherwise, just leave it in the drawers because all the furniture was standardized so they could just move their stuff with them and so forth. Years later, the last firm I worked for in Florida, the one that I approached the partners about teaching the kids, the gifted kids, we had an office, 10,000 square foot, set up using Herman Miller kinds of cubicles. And the plan there was that when they changed teams, say we got such and such condo development done, all right, that team is now going to be divided up into 3 schools and a couple office buildings and so forth. You would then move to be closer to your teammates. Now, that was the theory. In reality, we never did it. Once you had your place, that was it. What you did was you just got off your seat and walked over to your other teammates. And when you needed to have a team conversation, you met in the separate rooms. Now, the latest stuff I keep seeing is a spin-off of that, like, say, for Google or Zappos or any of the more contemporary kind of cutting-edge office ideas, is that they've done. They've created a lot of these smaller offices where people can have instant meetings, but they stay where they are and they don't move around,
right. And
which
they
was
also
the...
have designed for play, rest, meditation, all that as well, which I think is important because that's different. That's not something that I tended to see, in the past. But so I appreciate that.
In 2005, I spent 5 weeks in the Scandinavia area, basically in Copenhagen area, working with different companies and then traveling to visit friends in the other Scandinavian countries. And what I was doing was making presentations to different companies that were trying to become more innovative or more creative. And 2 of them, they were holding innovation fairs, which is a hot thing. I've done a variety of those for American companies as well as European and recently Asian. And one of the things that people will ask and says, oh, we want to create one of those creativity rooms. Well, that was what was being done in the 70s. Some of my colleagues who I've known for 40 years, they were the ones who did it at IBM. They were the ones that did it at Polaroid. They didn't last. Almost none of that lasted. Because the people found that having to get up from their working space to go to another space to then be creative wasn't as productive. It was fun at first, but then it became usual. And it no longer had that new spark. It's like, I believe what they're doing and what they demonstrated through magazine articles and books about Google or Zappos or some of them is much like what was done in the 70s. I'd be curious how long it lasts.
How do you feel?
And does it work?
I was going to say, how do you feel about people going off-site and doing things? I personally believe that, sometimes you just got to get out of your space and go somewhere else and get a new perspective.
Even individuals like myself who may work out of a single office, or what was on Facebook last week, several people were posting these things where people are building unique little buildings in the back of their property to go work, like little garrets or little studios and so forth. Apparently that's become a fad again. Yeah, there are, even for individuals, there are times when it's get up and go to that local Panera sandwich shop, put your earphones on like you have, and just get lost in a different environment. It does make a difference. But my studies show, because a lot of my studies had to do with thinking style, that doesn't work for everybody. All age brackets doesn't work for people in different professions easily.
Can you hear me? You're breaking up.
Thanks.
Okay, so.
There are variables such as your preferred way of thinking. Are you a very serious, logical, analytical thinker who prefers to work alone? Then space may or may not be of interest to you, as long as you have your own space. If you're a highly divergent um, thinking kind of person that sometimes can work with other people and other times can't at all, space becomes an issue for most of them. They have to be changing. It's one of the reasons in my house I can change the decor of my house in about 15 minutes because of the way I've done it. Is I collect fabrics from the different countries I traveled to, and I used to collect things. Stopped doing that so I could spread my money farther. And besides, my house looks like one of those tourist shops with all the stuff. You know, if you can see it, I can't see me.
I can see your mask. I love that. Yeah.
Mask. I used to collect key rings and put them on my camera strap to the point you couldn't see my camera anymore. But there are benefits to that. When I used to drop the camera until I learned to not drop the camera, is they would bounce off of all the key rings so that it was safe.
Okay.
What I mean is there are many variables that cause people to need different environments than other people. And the idea of separate rooms, separate spaces has its appeal, but I've not seen many examples where it was maintained for long, because when I go back and visit the same company, that room is now empty. It doesn't have the beanbag chairs anymore, which most people over 40 have trouble
getting in and out of. Yes. I totally get that.
Those are all interesting. Longevity-wise, I'm not sure.
One of the things that we started to talk about before our pre-conversation was about brainstorming. I would love for you to share what that actually is and the power when it's done well.
Okay. Alex Osborne, one of the main partners in BBD&O, one of the largest and longest running ad agencies in the world. Creativity. And he became fascinated. In the 20s, he started reading articles that people were writing about creativity and how to make it happen. And in the 30s, he came. But then he started getting to know some of these people. Well, in the late 30s, early 40s, he came up with this process that is generically called brainstorming. And what he was striving to do is find a way to help his people become more creative now, creative on demand. Because there were a lot of beliefs about the, what do we call them? The Greeks talked about them, not mentors.
Muses?
Muses? Say it again.
Muse?
Say
the
it again.
idea of a muse?
Yeah. The 7 muses. Well, in a work environment of working 8 to 5, 40 to 80 hours a week, if you rely on your muse, you're in deep trouble. Because the muse ain't going to be there very often. So what he was wanting to do is, how can I get my people to be more creative immediately? At least some. When it's a tough day, a boring day, they've had a bad week, and so forth. So he came up with what eventually they started calling inside the company brainstorming. They have 4 guidelines, not rules, guidelines. The goal is to generate as many ideas as possible, under the premise that based on probability, if one group has 100 ideas and another group only has 5, the one with 100 has a higher probability of having unique or creative ideas. Is that absolutely true? Of course not. Because I've met some highly, highly creative people who are loners who, when they're taking a creative thinking test, they come up with one idea and everybody else is coming up with 300. But their idea is the only one that's truly original. It's different. It's a style kind of thing. Anyway, the second is flexibility. So you want to be fluent. Many, many, many ideas. So, or the second one, correction, on his guidelines, no judgment. And that's one that's being harped on negatively too often right now. His premise was, it is hard to be creative and open-minded and be judgmental at the same time. Studies later by Sperry and Bogan and others in neuroscience claiming that the 2 functions of the brain, one that generates idea and one that may evaluate ideas, generally cannot work together at the same time. Supposedly there's evidence to show that. Well, he said, let's not be judgmental. We can judge later. Let's get the ideas out first, and then we'll evaluate them. So, what's too often lumped under the word critical thinking. Critical thinking is a category of hundreds of ways of thinking, not just being evaluative. The third is to hitchhike. You have an idea, I have an idea, we both say them out loud, but yours sparks another idea in my mind combining with mine. So you give me one, I give you one, we could have 4 different ideas. Easily. That was called hitchhiking. And then his fourth one was freewheel, which is the hardest one for most cultures to do, because it means anything that's said is accepted. Most people hold back. Most people will not say what's in their head, whether they understand it or not, whether they support it or not. And some of the wildest ideas are the ones that will lead to the solution. One of his quotes that I've used for 40 years now, it is easier to take a wild idea and tame it down into a solution than it is to take a practical idea and turn it into an exciting solution. And there are many examples you can see of that.
Well, why don't you give us an example?
You would ask that.
Of course.
Okay, I'll give you one from my reading of Disney and the history of Roy Disney and Walt. When they were opening Disney World, so what I've read said, there's a big difference between the environment in Orlando and the environment in Anaheim. One of them is, it rains in Orlando. And it can rain any time of the day. For 10 minutes, for an hour, on a rare occasion all day, but that's very rare. What do? Well, one of the problems, somebody shouted out an idea, let's have a rain parade. And at first, that's just an idea. It's not a solution. It hasn't been formed yet. What do you mean by a rain parade? And they dealt with that one and played with it. And eventually, when you go to Disney World, I haven't been there for a few years. I usually like to go about every 5 because then I see the new stuff. And I go play as a child and spend the whole day running from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And also I have relatives who work there, so I can get a discount or get in for free. Anyway, but when the parade comes, if it's raining, they're wearing waterproof uniforms or costumes. The electronic equipment is protected against potential shock. And there are massive areas of roof overhangs so people can back up and stand out of the rain and not have to have umbrellas all the time. That's close to one. That's not as wild as some. But that was one that I used to use as an example, is that they implied that the researchers for planning Disney World had not thought about that issue of rain. In reality, they had, so that story probably is a myth anyway, like many others about the Disney Corporation that make for great stories to learn from, like Aesop's fables, but not necessarily based on reality.
Okay. Well, at least it's a great example, though. It gives people an idea what you were talking about.
We were talking about earlier about the brainstorming. My big issue is with people who say that blatantly say brainstorming doesn't work. And this is backed on research. Well, I've looked at research from it's now almost 65 years. And yes, there are a couple of studies that supposedly report or indicate that brainstorming doesn't work all the time or not at all. Well, when you look at it, they weren't really doing a brainstorming session. They just had a bunch of people who didn't know why they were there in individual rooms with the person who had no skills in how to facilitate an idea-generating meeting, and they were told, generate ideas. And they call that brainstorming. No, because I have a website page devoted to this kind of stuff. I say, brainstorming, are you talking about the Alex Osborne technique that works, or are you talking about that cliche for bad meetings? But that's true of anything related to meetings. If it's not planned, there isn't an agenda, the reason the people are there and not for a valid reason and so forth, nothing will happen. That's what we were talking about earlier.
I have a question as far as, tools and techniques. When you conduct a brainstorming session, do you like people to use whiteboards, flip charts where they move around the room, just Post-it notes, do you have a preference, or what works best, do you think?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Facetious. It depends on the group. Like the 2-day program that I do, we experience many different ways to run what I prefer to call ideation sessions, not the cliche brainstorming with the negative connotation. And also, there are hundreds to thousands of idea generating techniques that have been generated or collected, especially over the last 60 years, if not 100 or two. If you look through the journals of Da Vinci, or you look through the journals of Darwin and so forth, you can find indications of techniques they used for generating ideas. Will work for some people, won't work for everybody, but you never know. And what I try to do is get people, in my interpretation or my variation of the Osborne-Barnes model, their original model, it's the acronym spelled with the first letters is of Pisa, which is the weirdest building on the face of the earth, but everybody knows about it, of Pisa. Right. It's a useless building, except when they closed it, it cost them millions of dollars and lost revenue. Now they've made it stand up. Not straight, but stand up safely, so you can still go in it. Or at least years ago they did. Anyway, that was a quick acronym to use to help me remember the process. And the 6 basic steps that Osborne and later Sid Barnes, who joined them, created was, 1, you look at the objectives. What are your objectives? So you take time, you diverge, and you list as many as possible. And then you may cluster them, you may examine them, and then narrow it down to 1. Because realistically, we can't really work on more than one problem at the same time. Multitasking is a nice myth. The second stage is, okay, now we have this objective. My objective right now may be to generate more clients. Okay, what are the facts involved? Okay, what are the past facts? Who were my clients before? Who were my clients recently? How did I find those clients? Did they pay me the same amount? Or which of these clients were down in the $100 range and which of the clients are in the thousands of dollars range? So you collect everything you know. So that's of, objective, and facts. Then you start writing problem-solving statements or problem statements. In what ways might I find new clients? In what ways might clients find me? And the goal in that stage is to write it as many different ways as you can, because the different perspective may open the door. We don't think about the problems enough. Most problems
really the quality
are not
of the question then that you're talking about.
You're looking for a better quality prose. You want to make sure it's not too specific, and you want to make sure it's not too general, like, why do you want to do that? I want to improve the lives of all people in the world. No, in what ways might, I mean, it gets to the point of ridiculous. It's called the Letter of Abstraction. So then from now you pick one problem statement that you or the group agrees that they're going to work on. Now you generate ideas. Now in my process, I use the number 8 to represent that instead of the letter I, because I call it ideate. And I want them to use 8 different techniques to generate ideas. This is not easy unless you've got experience doing it and have a facilitator that has experience doing it. And what I do is a variety of types, from a simple brainstorming to a simple brain writing, which means instead of yelling it out, you write them down. And there are many versions of that.
Brain dump kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. And then one that I saw someone from Pittsburgh Paint describe, and I gave it a name, White Paint. What he did was he wrote the issue was white paint in front of all of his researchers. And he said, we're going to generate ideas to create white paint that doesn't use titanium, because titanium is a finite resource. Whether they've actually done it or not, I've never seen evidence of it. What happened to that, because I haven't seen him in a long time, if he's still alive. But what he did was he wrote on the one side of the board, he wrote the word white. And he said, all right, tell me everything you think of when the word white is used. People would write all kinds of things. White paper is white, snow is white, ice is white, hail is white, and so forth. And on the right-hand side was paint. What do you think about? What's the use of paint? What is it? What is it made of? Blah, blah, blah. Write it all out. And then they would group looking for clues. As a young architect, I learned to do that in what is called the programming stage. I didn't know anything about brainstorming at the time, any of the techniques. What I would do is have the client and the representatives generate what they wanted. What is this building going to be? What do they need? And I said, be as wild and as crazy as possible. Don't worry about potential budgets or reality. Just what do you want? And then we narrow it down until we get there. Well, one of the things I found was now commonly taught and called clustering. You get 100 Post-it notes on the wall or 100 index cards held up with push pins, as we used to do in the Dark Ages. Now you cluster them. What patterns do you see? What categories do you see? And you don't force them on it. You let the material. And one of the ones that came out in that experiment, under white, was many of the things were natural. Snow, ice, sleet, hail. And then someone said, but they aren't white. They look white. Then the next question is, what makes them look white? What causes them to be white? And it's the cellular structure, the diamond-like shapes of the things. Then they looked at paint, and on paint they found types of paint, types of materials of paint, how long they last, what surfaces, and so forth. And then they went, okay, is there a type of paint that when used, it would do what those crystals of water do to make something look white? And what they found was a certain chemical being added to acrylic paint, the surface becomes crystallized.
Wow.
In other words, it becomes opaque. It's not white, but it looks white. Now, whether it's ever been into production or not, I haven't seen John in 20 years, so I don't know whether it is. I thought it was phenomenal, so I call that white paint. And it's what I did as an architect. Take the key adjectives and the key nouns and describe them in as much detail as possible. Then let the information tell you what the problem is.
Love that.
And it works. That one works for most of the analytical people, the highly systematic people. To them, it's too much work. To the people who come from their gut feeling and like to work with other people, the natural brainstormers, the extreme extroverts, as long as you keep it fun, they'll do anything.
Great.
And the intuitives, you got to give them the freedom to work alone or work with one or two other people. And let them go. I mean, go. Even if you let them leave the room and leave the building. One of the drawbacks when you set up teams, and one of the teams happens to be all highly intuitive or highly upper right brain, as it's often called, they tend to disappear. You have to go find them. They're usually at the pool or the bar or out on the lawn somewhere, and they lose track of time because time is not an issue for them. Anyway, does that help?
Yeah, and then that leads into, the idea that we need diverse teams. We need different people on our teams because they bring that different quality of creative thinking to the table, whether they're the innovator, the ideator, those kind of things.
Talking to Sarah for your book about the foresight, theirs is a model that has strong similarities to my mind model, is that the greatest teams tend to be heterogeneous. But at the same time, if you're doing very specific tasks, not a total problem solving, then you need homogeneous teams. If your goal is to organize what you're going to do, you don't want a diverse team. They'll drive each other nuts. Because one will be giving it time limits, the others, screw that. We don't need time limits, and so forth. So recently in my local Toastmasters club, we've dealt with the issue of everything is timed in Toastmasters.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of them.
Everything is timed. But the goal is to stay within the hour format and to teach people to stay on time. Give a speech 5 to 7 minutes. It's supposed to have been 5 to 7 minutes, but I ended up speaking for 9.5. Well, the group is very supportive, as most clubs are. And this particular club, no matter who the members have been in all the years I've been a member, or returned as a member again, they've always been very caring and giving. So the issue came up, let's waive the time so that all the speakers today could be considered for the best speaker. Well, I'm the curmudgeon who probably would have agreed with them 25 years ago, but now I say, wait a minute. Everything in Toastmasters is timed, and we want to compete in competitions. If we don't stay within the time limits, then we are not training ourselves to stay with them. And also from personal and professional experience, I've been one of those speakers on the last one on the agenda who was paid a lot of money, and they paid a lot of money to get me there. And instead of the hour I was supposed to have, I had 15 minutes. Why? Because all the amateurs before me, or those who didn't take, took more time than they needed. And there are a lot of reasons why that happens. So as a speaker, you talk to any National Speaker Association member who's been at it for a while, you've got to be flexible. If you were paid for an hour, there's no way you're going to do it. You don't have an hour. You don't make them stay. What you do is cut out what you don't really need, change how you're going to do it if you need to, and make it work. Because one time when that did happen to me, it was a city managers meeting from all over the state of, no, it was corrections wardens from all over the state of Georgia, and I was the last speaker. They were paying me to do an hour. I had 33 minutes. I let them go early and got a standing ovation.
I love it.
Now, did they remember much afterward? I hope they remembered the 3 key points. But the stories maybe helped them remember.
I love that.
But me running another half hour would only have gotten them to hate me.
Good way to talk about that. I love that because I'm speaking more myself, so I get that. I just have 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll end. I know you're a world traveler, and I'd love for you to talk about the role of travel and creativity and how it adds to your life.
One of the quickest ways to expand your creativity is to do different things. Do new things. Read different magazines. Read different books. Go to presentations about topics you know nothing about. If all you know about is abstract art, you might want to read something about Da Vinci and some of the other guys and gals. And travel's the quickest way to do that. When I travel, I have a variety of things that I strive to do in each new country. I don't always manage it, but I strive. And I can remember when I was going to Japan the first time, my host, which was a mutual friend of a friend, we both had this one friend, an executive from DuPont, who had made the connection for us. And this fellow had set up 2 speaking engagements for me. And about 3 or 4 weeks out, I was making all my plans for Japan. I was going to spend 3 days here, 4 days there, 2 days, and I had to figure out how long it took to get from one city to the next, whether I used trains or planes or buses or whatever. And I had it pretty much worked out. Had all the contacts in each place, so I had it with a little bit of flexibility in case something went wrong. Heaven forbid Murphy would ever be right. In fact, he's almost never wrong. He wrote to me and he said, what else are you going to do besides give the presentations for the groups I've lined up? He says, well, I try to do about 12 different things I've learned over the last 30 years of traveling. He says, 1, I go see the historical parts, which may mean walking the streets or going to museums. I try to see the contemporary art, contemporary design. I explore different kinds of food. I try to spend a lot of time in places where I can watch people so I can get a gathering of their clothing and habits. So see whether they contradict the stereotypes I might have for Japanese people. Anyway, I gave him the list of 12. I was there for 3 days, then I was on to another town, then to Tokyo, then back to Osaka, which is where he was based. In those first 3 days, he accomplished 11 of my 12 for me and wouldn't let me spend a dime when I was with him. I paid for my hotel, I paid for all my airfare, train, and all that stuff. And no, I didn't get paid by the groups. I got a meal, which is what we speakers refer to as the chicken circuit. What have they done to the chicken this time? Except over there it's rice and fish instead of chicken. Anyway, I happened to mention it after the second speech, because I was speaking to a group that was called, I don't remember the Japanese word, and I'm not sure if I ever knew how to pronounce it, but it was based on the Spencer Johnson's book, Who Moved My Cheese? And that was the organization, Who Moved My Cheese? In other words, teamwork and change. And I gave a presentation to them based on it. Well, their president of the group was sitting next to me at the dinner afterward. Japanese like to celebrate. And they always have wonderful dinners and sometimes drink a little more than maybe they ought to, but they manage to get home and back to work the next day, unlike maybe some Americans don't get back. Anyway, he asked me, and I said, well, I told him about Miyoshi-san had accomplished these 11 things, and I was just so impressed, and it was fantastic. But the only thing he didn't arrange was I, when possible, like to spend time with a family in that country, in their home, to see what their life is like, one-on-one, not just observing on the street. Didn't bat an eye. He looked and says, oh, you're coming back to Osaka on such and such date? You're going to be here for another day before you fly on to Korea? And I went, yes, I am. He says, good. As soon as you arrive, send me an email, make sure that I know you're here, and I will pick you up in the morning, and I will take you to spend time with the family. And the family was his in-laws.
I love that.
In their traditional Japanese house. As we entered a small, I still have many, many photos and images of that. Walked down this small aisle passageway to the backyard, which was beautifully landscaped with the rocks and the sand and the hibachi and all the different, whatever they call those reduced trees that they do. And then entered the home. Well, as I entered the home, besides nodding my head and them nodding their heads, the mother-in-law did a tea ceremony in my honor, which is tradition. And she made these desserts and prepared tea for me. It was wonderful. And then we had a wonderful day. I kept asking them, because I love to look in people's homes and ask them, if it doesn't seem overly personal, some cultures it is, why do you have that on your shelves? Why is that? And they just went in detail about everything. They love being asked. And some people do. I look at people's libraries. I look, what do they collect, like my mask behind me? Or on the walls, I've got flags and many other things. My house looks like a tourist shop. In fact, I think I may put that in my will. This house must be turned into a tourist bureau. That way they won't be able to throw all away. They'll be able to sell it. Ho, ho, ho. Anyway, travel gives you different perspectives and different opportunities. In my traveling to New Zealand next week, my hope, I'm going a couple days early, not as long as I would like to normally, but money is a little tighter for me this year, right now. So I just added a couple days on front. Well, it turns out the program is being held at a site outside of Wellington. In other words, once I get to the site, I'm not going to get to see Wellington. It's too far away. Well, I went through a group that I first belonged to when I went to around the world the first time, and the first place I went was New Zealand. It's a group called Servas. It's an Esperanto word, which is a language they tried to create in Europe that didn't catch on. It's a novelty. Some people know it or know a little bit of it, but no one speaks it or really writes it to the best of my knowledge. But Servas is spelled Servas, and I know it as being pronounced as Servas. It means friendship and freedom. The members of it open their homes to other travelers who are members. And the purpose is to get to know each other. And every Servas host I've ever had were some of the greatest experiences I've ever had. And I hand-selected people out of their directories because so many were willing, almost no one turned me down. My problem was, how do I narrow it down to which one? And I chose architects one time, artists another time, politicians another time, and so forth, which added more
Yeah, I
richness
spent a
to
month
it.
in New Zealand, and I connected with a ceramicist in New Zealand, in Nelson, and he took me to the local art school. He took me back to his house. You know, it was phenomenal. So yeah, it's I love travel, and that's why I wanted to ask you about it, because for me it has added so much richness to my life. You know, I've learned so much about other people, about myself, just being in those situations where you meet new people. It's an amazing opportunity.
Example, it never fails, and I just had this happen with one group that we're talking about future in the year, is their trouble with some of the Americans and how finicky they are about what they want. Well, there are still Americans typically do not travel compared to other countries. The number of passports has skyrocketed, but then dropped off. I just did some checking on that compared to what it was prior to 9/11. But it went up, but it's gone down again. But it's still much higher than it ever was before 9/11. Is Americans tend to go on tours.
Yeah, I go by
hate
myself.
tours.
I've traveled by myself. Yeah.
I go by myself or with one or two other people. I had two travel buddies that we used to go all over South Africa for a week or so before the conference. And our personalities were perfect. Does it work all the time? No. You really have to have. Because when I traveled initially in 77, I was by myself. Yeah, I met people, and we didn't stay in the same room, but we might have eaten a few meals together, and that was kind of fun. In 78, I talked who would become my second wife into going with me, and we decided after 5 weeks of traveling day by day, not knowing for sure where we're going next with the Rail Pass, that we could live together and actually get married, and we did. But then in 82, I got the opportunity to teach for the University of Georgia's Travel Abroad program, mostly for artists in theater and landscape people, because there is no architectural program in Georgia. And it was a phenomenal experience. But traveling with 185 people, students, other faculty, family, artists, and residents, didn't prove to be as much fun. There wasn't as much flexibility. And when the students, there were like 3 buses or 4 buses most of the time to handle all those people when we were traveling in mass. Well, one of the students went racing up to the front to slip her favorite audio disc music in. That's when it was too much.
I have one girlfriend I traveled with since we're high school. You know, now she's we're going to hopefully travel again. But you know, everybody's been married, have their kids, and that kind of thing. And then it was really fun this summer. I went to near Asheville. It's called Bringley School of Design, has an art program in the summer up in the little Switzerland. And so my sister and I went together, and we shared a room, and we hadn't done that in years, you know. So I understand it, but we got along great, so it was fun. You know what? I see the time. We are running out of time. This has been phenomenal. I love getting to know you, and I hope to get to know you better as we go along. How can people find you?
Okay, my email is Alan, ALAN, at CRE, the number 8, N as in Nathan, G as in George.com. Or they can go to Google and just type my name in and you'll get millions of hits, only because my names are all common. And also I've been a very active little website person for almost 30 years, since websites were created in the early 90s. And so if you type my name, Robert Allen Black, in, you'll get 160 million. Sadly, unfortunately, a bunch of them are still about my being in jail or prison back in October. That doesn't seem to want to go away.
That's a story I probably want to hear at some point. So, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody, all the other creative activists out there are going to love hearing about you and finding out more about what you had to say. So thank you.
Keep up what you're doing. Remember that creativity means many things to many different people. And all of us are, if we choose to be.
Have a good day.
Love to have a copy. When you get it all copied, I'd love to have a copy of this.
I'm not editing it. I'm really just going to post it on YouTube.
That's just let me know what the
will,
URL
and
is.
we'll go from there. Yeah, I'm not into the editing part. You saw how hard it was for me just to record this.
Totally understand.
Technology and I are learning. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a great trip.